I died for 3 days in the winter of 1847, and when I woke, I could see what no living person should ever see. That is how this story begins, though it would take me years to understand that death had not been my ending, but rather the strange and terrible gift that would lead me to him. My name is Cecilia Ashworth, and I was 23 years old when my aunt sent me to Ravensmoor. I had been, until then, what society quietly called a disappointment. The only daughter of a second son, I possessed neither fortune nor remarkable beauty, and after my accident, I possessed something far worse, a reputation for strangeness. I had spoken too openly of the things I saw in the corners of rooms. I had mentioned shadows that moved without bodies to cast them. I had, in short, made myself unmarriageable, and my aunt, a practical woman with limited patience, had decided that if I could not be wed, I could at least be useful. The Dowager Duchess of Ravensmoor required a companion. She was elderly, half-blind, and known throughout the county for her sharp tongue and sharper memory. She had outlived 2 husbands and 1 son, and now resided in the east wing of the great estate, while her grandson, the young Duke, occupied the rest of the house in what the servants called perfect solitude. My aunt assured me it was a respectable position. She did not mention that no companion had lasted longer than 3 months. She did not mention the rumors. I arrived at Ravensmoor on an October evening, when the fog lay so thick upon the moors that the carriage seemed to float through clouds rather than travel upon solid ground. The estate emerged from the mist like a dream one cannot quite remember upon waking, all gray stone and black windows and towers that disappeared into the low-hanging sky. I counted 14 chimneys before the fog swallowed the rest, and I wondered how many fires it would take to warm such a place, and whether any fire could ever truly succeed. The housekeeper who greeted me was a tall woman named Mrs. Pemberton, with gray hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her face into an expression of permanent disapproval. She looked at my single trunk and my worn traveling dress and my ungloving hands, red from the cold, and I saw her make a calculation in her eyes. She was deciding how long I would last. I did not blame her. I was making the same calculation myself. She led me through corridors that seemed to multiply with every turning, past portraits of men and women whose painted eyes followed our passage with aristocratic disdain. The candles in their sconces flickered as we passed, though I felt no draught, and twice I thought I heard footsteps behind us, though when I turned, there was nothing but shadow and silence. Mrs. Pemberton did not turn. She walked with the determined stride of someone who had long ago decided not to see what she did not wish to see, and I envied her that blindness with all my heart. My room was small but clean, with a narrow bed and a writing desk, and a window that overlooked the gardens, or what had once been gardens. In the dying light, I could see only tangles of overgrown roses and paths that led nowhere, and a stone fountain whose basin had long ago filled with dead leaves. Beyond the gardens, barely visible through the mist, stood a structure I could not quite identify, a building of some kind, its windows dark. "That is the old ballroom," Mrs. Pemberton said, following my gaze. "It has not been used in 5 years, not since Lady Evangeline." I waited for her to continue, but she pressed her lips together as though she had already said too much. I wanted to ask who Lady Evangeline was and what had happened 5 years ago, but something in Mrs. Pemberton's face warned me that questions would not be welcome. Not yet. Not from a stranger who had been in the house less than an hour. "Dinner is at 7, she said. "The Dowager Duchess dines in her rooms. You will join her there. And Miss Ashworth," she added, pausing at the door, "it would be best if you did not wander the house after dark. The Duke values his privacy, and there are parts of the estate that are not safe for those unfamiliar with them." I nodded, though I did not ask what she meant by safe. I had learned, in the years since my accident, that there were questions whose answers I did not truly wish to know. I unpacked my few belongings and changed into my only dinner dress, a gray silk that had once belonged to my mother and had been altered so many times it no longer remembered its original shape. In the small mirror above the washstand, I looked pale and tired, my dark hair escaping its pins, my eyes too large in my thin face. I looked, I thought, like exactly what I was, a woman on the margins of life, watching from the edges while others danced at the center. It was then, as I turned from the mirror, that I saw her for the first time. She stood in the corner of my room, near the window, a woman made of light and mist and something that was not quite either. Her form shifted and wavered like a reflection in disturbed water, but I could see the shape of her clearly enough. A young woman in a pale gown, her hair loose around her shoulders, her face turned toward the window as though she were looking out at something I could not see. She did not look at me. She did not seem to know I was there. But I felt, with a certainty that went beyond reason, that she was waiting for something. Or someone. I closed my eyes and counted to 10, the way I had taught myself to do in the months after my accident. When I opened them again, the corner was empty. Only the curtains moved, stirred by a draft that seemed to come from nowhere. I told myself it was exhaustion. I told myself it was the strangeness of a new place, the power of suggestion, the lingering effects of Mrs. Pemberton's cryptic warnings. I told myself all the things I had been telling myself for years, and I believed none of them. But I smoothed my hair and straightened my dress and went down to dinner as though nothing had happened, because that was what I had learned to do. That was how I survived. The Dowager Duchess was not what I expected. I had imagined a frail old woman wrapped in shawls, querulous and demanding. What I found was a sharp-eyed matriarch in black silk, sitting upright in a chair by the fire, her silver hair arranged in an elaborate style that must have taken her maid an hour to achieve. Her face was lined but handsome, her gaze clear and penetrating despite the milky film that covered her left eye. She studied me for a long moment when I entered, and I had the uncomfortable feeling that she saw more than most people with perfect vision. "So you are the new companion," she said. "You look like a governess, all gray dress and serious expression. Do you play cards, Miss Ashworth?" "I do, Your Grace." "Well, that is something. The last one could not manage even a simple game of whist. Sat there weeping over the cards as though they had personally offended her." She gestured to the chair across from her. "Sit. Tell me why you are here, and do not give me the polite version. I am too old for politeness." I sat, and I told her. Not everything, but enough. The accident, the fever, the things I had seen afterward, or thought I had seen, the way my family had looked at me, first with concern, then with fear, then with the particular kind of pity that is worse than contempt. The way I had learned to keep silent, to pretend, to make myself small and unobtrusive and safe. By the time I finished, my hands were trembling in my lap, and I was certain she would ring for Mrs. Pemberton and have me sent away on the next coach. Instead, she smiled. It was not a kind smile, but it was not cruel either. It was the smile of someone who had heard a great many secrets in her long life and found this one merely interesting. "You see things," she said, "things that others cannot see." I hesitated. "Sometimes. And you saw something tonight, in your room, before you came down." I stared at her. How could she possibly know that? She leaned forward, her good eye bright in the firelight. "Because you are not the first, Miss Ashworth. There have been others. Other young women who came to this house and saw things they could not explain. Most of them fled. A few stayed long enough to convince themselves they had imagined it all. But none of them," she paused, and something flickered across her face. Something that might have been pain or might have been hope. None of them have been able to help her. "Help whom?" I whispered. But the Dowager Duchess only shook her head and called for the supper tray, and though I asked twice more during the meal, she would not speak of it again. She taught me instead how she liked her tea prepared, and which books she wished to have read aloud, and how she expected the fire to be kept at precisely the right level, not too high and not too low. She treated me, in short, as though our strange confession had never happened, and by the time I returned to my room that night, I had almost convinced myself that I had imagined it. Almost. I could not sleep. The wind had risen since evening, and it moaned around the corners of the great house like something in mourning. I lay in my narrow bed and listened to the sounds of the old estate settling around me, the creak of ancient timbers, the rattle of windows in their frames, the distant thud of a door somewhere in the depths of the house, and beneath it all, so faint I might have been imagining it, the sound of music. I rose from my bed without making a conscious decision to do so. I put on my dressing gown and my slippers and took the candle from my nightstand, and I walked out into the corridor as though something were pulling me forward by an invisible thread. The music grew louder as I walked. A waltz played on a piano that seemed to echo from somewhere far below, its melody sweet and sad and somehow familiar, though I was certain I had never heard it before. I descended the main staircase and crossed the entrance hall, past the portraits with their watching eyes, past the cold marble statues, past the doors that led to rooms I had not yet seen. The music drew me on, through a passage I did not remember, down a corridor that seemed to go on forever, until I stood before a door of dark wood with a handle of tarnished brass. The music stopped. I should have turned back. I knew I should have turned back. But my hand was already on the handle, and the door was already opening, and then I was standing on the threshold of the old ballroom, and everything I thought I knew about the world changed forever. The room was vast and dark, lit only by the candles that burned in silver candelabras along the walls. Their flames did not flicker. They burned straight and steady as though no draught could touch them, casting pools of golden light across a floor of polished wood. Dust covered everything except a single clear path in the center of the room, a path worn smooth by footsteps, by dancing, by a ritual I was only beginning to understand. And there, in the center of that path, stood the Duke of Ravensmoor. He was tall and dark-haired, dressed in evening clothes as though he were attending a ball rather than standing alone in a forgotten room at midnight. His face was handsome in a severe way, all sharp angles and shadows, and his eyes, when they met mine, were the color of winter ice. He should have been angry at my intrusion. He should have demanded to know what I was doing there, how I had dared to enter his private sanctuary. But he only looked at me with an expression I could not read, something between despair and hope, and I realized with a shock that he was not surprised to see me. He had been expecting someone, just not me. And then I saw his shadow. It fell across the floor behind him, long and dark in the candlelight. But it was not shaped like a man standing alone. It was shaped like a man dancing, his arms extended, his hands clasped around something invisible. And beside that shadow, connected to it, holding it, was the shadow of a woman. I looked up from the floor, my heart pounding, and I saw her. She stood before the Duke, her hand in his, her head tilted back as though she were about to laugh. She was made of light and mist, just as she had been in my room, but here she was clearer, more present, more real. I could see the shape of her face now, delicate and lovely, and the fall of her pale hair, and the lines of a gown that seemed to drift around her like smoke. She was dancing with him, swaying gently to music that no longer played, and the expression on her face was one of such profound longing that I felt tears spring to my eyes. She was beautiful, and she was trapped, and she was looking directly at me. The Duke followed her gaze. For a long moment, the three of us stood there in the candlelit darkness, bound together by something I did not yet understand. Then the woman made of light released the Duke's hand and took a step toward me, and the Duke made a sound I will never forget, a sound of loss so pure and terrible that it seemed to echo in the empty spaces of my heart. The candles went out, all at once, as though extinguished by a single breath. I heard the Duke's footsteps crossing the floor toward me, and I heard my own heartbeat thundering in my ears, and I heard, from somewhere very far away, the fading notes of a waltz. When the light returned, struck from a match in the Duke's trembling hand. The woman was gone. But I knew, with a certainty that went beyond sight, that she had not disappeared. She was still there, somewhere in the darkness of that room, waiting, watching, hoping. The Duke looked at me across the shadows, and his voice, when he spoke, was rough with something I would later learn to recognize as grief. "You saw her," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," I whispered. He closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, they were wet with tears he did not bother to hide. "Then God help us both," he said, "because I have been waiting 5 years for someone who could." I did not return to my room that night. Instead, I sat in the ballroom with the Duke of Ravensmoor while the candles burned low around us, and I listened as he began to tell me the story of Lady Evangeline, the woman he had loved and lost, the woman whose ghost still danced with him in the darkness. His voice was quiet and broken, and his hands shook as he spoke, and I understood, with a clarity that surprised me, that this cold and solitary man was not cold at all. He was burning. He had been burning for 5 years, and no one had been able to see the flames, until now. Outside, the wind continued to moan around the corners of the great house, and somewhere in the shadows, a woman made of light and mist waited for the story to continue. And I, Cecilia Ashworth, the invisible woman, the strange one, the disappointment, sat in the candlelight and felt something stir in my chest that I had not felt in years. It might have been hope. It might have been fear. It might have been the first faint stirring of a love I did not yet know how to name. All I knew for certain was that I would not be leaving Ravensmoor. Not now. Perhaps not ever. The Duke's eyes met mine across the darkness, and for one brief moment I saw past the grief and the guilt to something else beneath. Something that recognized me. Something that had been waiting, just as I had been waiting, for a connection neither of us had believed we would ever find. The candle between us flickered, and in the shadows on the floor, 2 figures still danced, though only one of them was alive. I did not look away. The Duke spoke until dawn touched the windows of the ballroom with fingers of gray light, and I listened without interruption, afraid that any word from me might shatter the fragile thing that had opened between us. His name was Alexander, though I did not yet dare to think of him by that name. He was 31 years old, and he had been in love with Lady Evangeline Fairfax since he was 19 and she was 17, when they had met at a summer ball and danced together beneath a canopy of roses. He spoke of her the way one speaks of sacred things, with reverence and pain, and a longing so deep it seemed to have no bottom. They had been engaged for 2 years before the night of the ball, 2 years of letters and stolen conversations and the careful, formal courtship that society demanded. He had loved her with the particular intensity of a man who had never expected to love anyone, a man who had been raised to value duty above feeling and had found in Evangeline something that made duty seem small and feeling seem infinite. She had been gentle and kind and full of light, he said, and when he spoke those words, I understood why her ghost still glowed in the darkness. She had been made of light even when she was alive. The ball had been held to celebrate their engagement. 300 guests had filled the very room where we now sat, and the candles had burned bright, and the music had played until well past midnight. Evangeline had worn a gown of ivory silk, and Alexander had danced with her 7 times, which was 3 times more than propriety allowed. He had not cared. He had wanted the whole world to see how much he loved her. He had wanted everyone to know that she was his and he was hers, and nothing would ever separate them. At 11:30, Evangeline had excused herself to rest. She had seemed tired, he said, though she had smiled and kissed his cheek and promised to return before the final waltz. He had watched her leave the ballroom, her ivory gown trailing behind her like a cloud, and that was the last time he saw her alive. She never returned. By midnight, he had gone looking for her. By 1 in the morning, he had searched every room in the house. By dawn, he had organized a search of the grounds, the gardens, the woods that bordered the estate. 50 men had combed every inch of Ravensmoor, and they had found nothing. No body, no sign of struggle, no explanation. Lady Evangeline Fairfax had simply vanished, as though she had never existed at all. The scandal had been immense. Society whispered that Alexander had killed her, that he had hidden the body, that the engagement had been a facade for something dark and terrible. His own family had looked at him with suspicion, and Evangeline's family had accused him publicly, and for a time it had seemed that he would be arrested and tried for a murder he had not committed. But there was no evidence. There was no body. There was nothing but silence and questions and a grief so profound that it had nearly destroyed him. He had withdrawn from society after that. He had closed the ballroom and dismissed most of the servants and lived alone in the great house with only his grandmother for company. He had told himself that Evangeline would return, that she had been taken by someone who would eventually demand a ransom, that there was some explanation he simply had not yet discovered. But weeks became months, and months became years, and no explanation came. Only the ghost. She had appeared to him on the first anniversary of her disappearance. He had been sitting alone in the ballroom, drunk on whiskey and grief, and suddenly she was there, dancing in the darkness where they had danced together so many times before. He had thought he was hallucinating. He had thought the drink had finally broken his mind. But she had looked at him with such tenderness, such sorrow, such desperate longing, that he had known she was real, or as real as something beyond death could be. He had tried to speak to her. He had tried to touch her. But she could not hear him, and his hands passed through her like mist, and all she did was dance over and over again, the same waltz they had danced on the night she disappeared. Every night for 5 years, he had come to the ballroom and danced with her shadow, and every night she had looked at him with those eyes full of unspoken words, and every night he had failed to understand what she was trying to tell him, until I came. She looked at you, he said, and his voice was hoarse from hours of speaking. For the first time in 5 years, she looked at someone else. She saw you, Miss Ashworth. She knows you can see her. I did not know what to say. I was exhausted and overwhelmed and more frightened than I had ever been in my life. But beneath the fear, beneath the exhaustion, I felt something else. I felt purpose. I felt meaning. For the first time since my accident, I felt that my strange and terrible gift might be something other than a curse. "What do you want me to do?" I asked. His eyes met mine, and in them I saw a vulnerability that he had hidden from the world for 5 years. I saw the young man he had been before grief had carved him into stone, the man who had loved without reservation and lost without understanding. I saw, though I did not yet recognize it, the first faint stirring of something that would change both our lives. "I want you to help me find out what happened to her," he said. "I want you to help me set her free." I should have refused. I should have remembered my place, my position, the careful anonymity I had cultivated to protect myself from a world that feared what it did not understand. But I thought of the woman made of light, dancing alone in the darkness, waiting for someone to finally see her. I thought of the Duke, burning with grief that no one else could see, and I thought of myself, invisible for so long, finally visible to someone who needed me. "Yes," I said, "I will try." The days that followed were strange and suspended, as though Ravensmoor existed outside of time. I continued my duties with the Dowager Duchess, reading to her in the mornings and playing cards with her in the afternoons and listening to her stories of the Ravensmoor of her youth, when the house had been full of laughter and music and the promise of futures that had not yet been broken. She did not mention our conversation on my first night, and she did not ask about the ballroom or the ghost or the Duke. But sometimes when she thought I was not looking, I caught her watching me with an expression I could not quite read, something between hope and fear and a sadness so deep it seemed to have no name. In the evenings, after the Dowager had retired, I met Alexander in the library. He had given me permission to call him by his Christian name, though I still stumbled over it, still felt the impropriety of such intimacy between a duke and a companion. But he insisted, and I found that I liked the sound of it on my tongue, the way it made him seem less like a figure from a portrait and more like a man. He showed me everything he had collected about Evangeline's disappearance: letters, newspaper clippings, interviews with servants who had long since left Ravensmoor, maps of the grounds with every searched location marked in red ink. He had been investigating her vanishing for 5 years, he told me, and he had found nothing. No clues, no suspects, no explanation that made any sense. "But you have something I do not have," he said, leaning across the table where his documents were spread. "You can see her. You can communicate with her in ways I cannot. Perhaps she can tell you what she cannot tell me." I was not certain that was true. My gift, if it could be called that, had never been so precise. I saw things that others could not see, yes, but I did not control what I saw, and the spirits I encountered did not always wish to communicate. Some of them simply existed, trapped in moments of their past, unaware that anyone was watching. Some of them were angry, violent, dangerous, and some of them were so faded that I could barely make out their forms, echoes of people who had once been real but were now little more than impressions in the air. Evangeline, however, was different. I had felt it from the first moment I saw her. She was present in a way that other spirits were not. She was aware. She was trying to communicate something, even if she could not find the words. "I will try," I told Alexander again, and I saw the gratitude in his eyes, the desperate hope that he was trying so hard to contain. That night, I went to the ballroom alone. The candles were already burning when I arrived, though I had not lit them. They flickered in their silver holders, casting dancing shadows across the polished floor. And I understood that this was Evangeline's doing. She was waiting for me. She had been waiting, perhaps, since the moment I arrived at Ravensmoor. I stood in the center of the room where Alexander usually stood and closed my eyes. I tried to quiet my mind, to open myself to whatever she wished to show me. The air around me grew cold, and I smelled something faint and sweet, like roses in summer, and I knew she was there before I opened my eyes. She stood before me, closer than she had been before. I could see her face clearly now, the delicate features, the pale hair, the eyes that were the color of sea glass. She was beautiful, achingly beautiful, and so sad that I felt tears prick at my own eyes in sympathy. "Lady Evangeline," I whispered, "can you hear me?" She tilted her head, as though listening to something very far away. Her lips moved, but no sound came out, only a breath of cold air that seemed to carry words I could not quite understand. "I am here to help you," I said. "Alexander sent me. He wants to know what happened to you. He wants to set you free." At the mention of Alexander's name, something changed in her face. The sadness deepened, but there was something else there too, something fiercer. She reached toward me, her transparent hand hovering just inches from my face, and I felt a jolt of cold that went through me like lightning. And then I saw. It was not a vision exactly. It was more like a memory that was not my own, a fragment of experience that Evangeline pressed into my mind with desperate urgency. I saw the ballroom as it had been on the night of her disappearance, full of light and music and the swirl of dancing couples. I saw myself, or rather Evangeline, looking across the crowded room at Alexander, who was talking to a group of gentlemen near the champagne table. I felt her love for him, warm and certain and absolute. And I felt her exhaustion, the heaviness in her limbs, the strange dizziness that had been plaguing her all evening. She excused herself from the guests around her and made her way toward the door. She needed air, she needed quiet. She needed to rest for just a moment before the final waltz, the waltz she had promised to Alexander, the waltz they would remember for the rest of their lives. The corridor outside the ballroom was dim and cool. She leaned against the wall for a moment, closing her eyes, and when she opened them again, Someone was standing before her, a figure in dark clothes, face hidden in shadow. She tried to speak, tried to ask who it was, but her voice would not come. Her body would not obey her commands. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, and she realized with a shock of horror that she had been drugged. The figure reached for her, and then the vision dissolved into darkness. I gasped and stumbled backward, my heart racing, my breath coming in short, sharp bursts. Evangeline was gone. The candles had extinguished themselves, and I was alone in the darkness of the ballroom, trembling with the aftershocks of what I had seen. Someone had done this to her. Someone had drugged her, taken her, hidden her away on the night of her greatest joy. And that someone had been at the ball. That someone had been a guest, or a servant, or someone close enough to put something in her drink without being noticed. Alexander had not killed her. I had known that already, had felt it in my bones from the first moment I saw his grief. But now I knew something else. Something that changed everything. Evangeline had not simply disappeared. She had been taken, and whoever had taken her was almost certainly still at Ravensmoor. I found Alexander in the library, where he had fallen asleep over his documents, his dark head resting on his folded arms. In the candlelight, he looked younger, more vulnerable, the sharp lines of his face softened by exhaustion. I hesitated to wake him, struck by a tenderness I had not expected to feel. He had been carrying this burden alone for so long. He had been fighting a battle no one else could see, just as I had been fighting my own invisible war. We were alike, I realized, both of us marked by experiences that had set us apart from the world. Both of us waiting, without knowing it, for someone who could finally understand. I touched his shoulder gently, and he woke with a start, his eyes meeting mine with an intensity that made my breath catch in my throat. "Miss Ashworth," he said, and then, more softly, "Cecilia. What is it? What happened?" I told him what I had seen, the vision, the drugging, the figure in the shadows. I watched his face as I spoke, watched the hope and the horror warring in his eyes, watched the realization dawn that his beloved had not abandoned him, had not left him voluntarily, had been stolen from him by someone he might have known, might have trusted, might have invited into his home. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment. Then he reached out and took my hands in his, and I felt the warmth of his skin against mine, the trembling of his fingers, the desperate gratitude in his grip. "You have given me more in one night than 5 years of searching," he said. "You have given me hope that I might finally find the truth." I wanted to tell him that I had done very little, that Evangeline had shown me these things, that I was only a vessel for her memories. But the way he was looking at me made the words die in my throat. No one had ever looked at me like that before. As though I mattered, as though I was valuable, as though I was something more than a burden to be tolerated or a strangeness to be feared. "We will find out what happened," I said, and I meant it with every fiber of my being. "We will find out who did this, and we will set her free." He nodded, but he did not release my hands. We stood there in the candlelit library, bound together by grief and mystery and something else, something neither of us had names for yet. Outside, the wind had stilled, and the house was silent, and somewhere in the darkness, a woman made of light waited for the truth to finally emerge. I did not sleep for the rest of that night. I sat in my small room and watched the dawn break over the gardens, over the overgrown roses and the forgotten paths and the dark shape of the ballroom in the distance. My mind was racing with questions I could not yet answer. Who had been at the ball that night? Who had access to Evangeline's drink? Who had reason to want her gone, to want to destroy the happiness she had found with Alexander? And beneath those questions, quieter but no less insistent, was another question. A question about myself, about the way my heart had quickened when Alexander took my hands, about the warmth I had felt spreading through my chest, a warmth I had thought I would never feel again. I was here to help a ghost find peace. I was here to solve a mystery that had haunted this house for 5 years. I was not here to fall in love with a man who was still devoted to another woman, a woman who existed now only as light and memory and the echo of a waltz. But as I watched the sun rise over Ravensmoor, I felt something shift inside me, something dangerous, something I could not control. I pressed my hand to my heart and told myself it meant nothing. I told myself it was gratitude or sympathy, or the strange intensity of the circumstances we shared. I told myself all the sensible things a sensible woman would think, and I believed none of them. Below my window, in the garden that no one tended anymore, a single white rose bloomed against the gray stone wall. It should not have been blooming in October. It should not have survived the cold. But there it was, perfect and impossible, a flower out of season. I looked at it for a long time, and I thought of Evangeline, and I thought of Alexander, and I thought of myself. And I wondered, not for the first time, whether love could bloom in impossible places too. The investigation began in earnest the following morning, though investigation is perhaps too formal a word for what we did. We searched, we questioned, we pieced together fragments of a night that had shattered into 1,000 pieces 5 years ago, hoping that somewhere in the wreckage we might find the truth. Alexander had kept meticulous records of everyone who had attended the engagement ball. 312 guests, he told me, spreading the list across the library table. Every name verified, every alibi checked, every person interviewed at least twice in the weeks after Evangeline disappeared. I ran my finger down the columns of names, recognizing some from the society pages I had read in my aunt's house, others completely unknown to me. Lords and ladies, baronets and knights, wealthy merchants and their ambitious wives. The cream of English society had gathered at Ravensmoor that night to celebrate a love match that everyone had envied, and one of them had come to destroy it. We need to narrow the list, I said. The person who drugged Evangeline must have had access to her drink. That means someone close to her, someone who could approach without suspicion. Alexander nodded, his jaw tight. I have thought of this. The servants who worked the ball, the footmen who carried the trays, the guests who stood near her that evening. But I know these people, Cecilia. I have known some of them my entire life. I cannot imagine any of them doing something so monstrous. I looked at him, at the pain in his eyes, and I understood his struggle. It is one thing to hunt for a faceless villain, a shadowy figure in a dark corridor. It is another thing entirely to consider that the villain might have a name you know, a face you have trusted, a hand you have shaken in friendship. We must consider everyone, I said gently, even those you trust, especially those you trust. He was silent for a moment, and then he nodded again, more firmly this time. You are right. Where do we begin? We began with the guest list. Alexander told me about each person who had been close to Evangeline that night, the friends she had spoken with, the relatives who had gathered around her, the acquaintances who had offered their congratulations. Most of them, he assured me, had no conceivable motive. They had loved Evangeline, or at least had no reason to harm her. But there were a few names that gave him pause. The first was Lord Marcus Ashby, Evangeline's cousin. He had been her closest male relative, her protector in society since her father's death when she was 15. He had approved of the match with Alexander, had given them his blessing publicly. But Alexander remembered now, with the clarity that grief sometimes brings, that Marcus had seemed distracted that night, uneasy. He had left the ball early, before Evangeline's disappearance was discovered, claiming a sudden illness. The second name was more unexpected. Lady Helena Vane, Alexander's own sister, had been at the ball as well. She had never liked Evangeline, Alexander admitted, his voice heavy with reluctance. She thought the match was beneath our family. Evangeline was wealthy, but her title was new, her bloodline not as ancient as ours. Helena made her disapproval known in 1,000 small ways, though she never opposed the engagement openly. I watched his face as he spoke of his sister. There was something there, some old wound that had never quite healed, but I did not press him. Not yet. There would be time for those questions later. The third name was perhaps the most troubling of all. Dr. Edmund Blackwood, the family physician, had been at the ball that night. He had attended to several guests who felt unwell, had moved freely through the rooms with his medical bag, had access to any number of substances that could cause the symptoms Evangeline had experienced. He had been a trusted figure at Ravensmoor for years, but there was something about him that had always unsettled Alexander, a coldness in his eyes, a precision in his manner that seemed to go beyond professional detachment. These three, then, would be our starting point. But before we could begin our inquiries, we needed more information from the only witness who truly knew what had happened that night. We needed Evangeline. I returned to the ballroom that evening, but this time Alexander came with me. He stood beside me in the candlelit darkness, his shoulder almost touching mine, and together we waited for his lost love to appear. She came as she always came, materializing from the shadows like a dream taking shape. But tonight, there was something different about her. She seemed more solid, more present, as though my presence was somehow strengthening her connection to this world. She looked at Alexander first, and the love in her eyes was so raw, so pure, that I had to look away. It felt wrong to witness such intimacy, even the intimacy of the dead. But then she turned to me, and her expression changed. There was urgency in her face now, desperation. She reached toward me again, and I braced myself for the cold shock of her touch, for the visions that might come. This time, the vision was different. I saw a room I did not recognize, small and dark, with walls of rough stone and a floor of packed earth. There was a narrow bed in one corner, a single candle burning on a wooden table, and a window so small that only a sliver of daylight could enter. It was a prison, I realized, a place of confinement, and Evangeline was there, lying on the bed, her eyes open but unseeing, her body still as death. But she was not dead. I could see her chest rising and falling, could see the flutter of her pulse in her throat. She was alive, but she was drugged, held in a stupor that kept her docile and compliant. And standing over her, his face still hidden in shadow, was the figure who had taken her from the ballroom. He spoke, but his voice was distorted, as though coming from very far away. I could not make out the words, only the tone, cold and calculating and utterly without remorse. He was explaining something to her unconscious form, justifying his actions, but the meaning slipped away from me like water through fingers. And then the vision shifted, and I saw something else. A garden. Not the overgrown tangle behind Ravensmoor, but a formal garden, perfectly manicured, with hedges trimmed into geometric shapes and a fountain at its center that sparkled in the sunlight. I did not recognize it, but I felt, with the strange certainty that my visions sometimes brought, that it was important, that somewhere in that garden lay a clue that would lead us to the truth. The vision ended as abruptly as it had begun. I gasped and stumbled, and Alexander caught me, his arms wrapping around me with an instinctive protectiveness that made my heart ache. I leaned against him for a moment, drawing strength from his warmth, from the solid reality of his body in a world that had suddenly become very uncertain. "What did you see?" he asked, his voice rough with concern. I told him. The room, the bed, the figure, the garden. I told him everything, and I watched his face as the pieces began to fall into place in his mind. "The garden," he said slowly. "I know that garden. It belongs to Marcus Ashby. I attended a party there once, years ago, before Evangeline and I were engaged. My heart began to beat faster. Could it be that simple? Could Evangeline's own cousin have been the one to steal her away?" But Alexander was shaking his head. "Marcus loved Evangeline," he said. "He would never have hurt her. There must be some other explanation. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that the world was not so cruel as to make a woman's protector into her destroyer. But I had seen too much in my strange and difficult life to believe in easy answers. "We must speak to him," I said. "We must find out what he knows." Alexander agreed, though I could see the reluctance in his eyes. He sent a letter the next morning, inviting Lord Marcus Ashby to Ravensmoor on the pretense of discussing estate business. The reply came 2 days later, polite but distant. Lord Ashby would be honored to visit. He would arrive the following week. In the meantime, we continued our investigation. Alexander showed me every room of Ravensmoor, every corridor, every hidden passage. The house was vast and ancient, full of secrets that had accumulated over centuries. There were rooms that had not been opened in decades, wings that had been closed off after deaths or scandals, cellars that descended into darkness so complete that even our lanterns seemed swallowed by it. It was in one of these cellars that I found the first physical clue. We were searching the wine cellars, hoping to find some trace of the drug that had been used on Evangeline. Alexander did not truly believe we would find anything, I could tell, but he indulged my thoroughness with a patience that touched me. He held the lantern while I examined the dusty bottles, looking for anything out of place, anything that might have been added or removed. And then I saw it. A small wooden box, tucked behind a rack of vintage Burgundy, almost invisible in the shadows. I pulled it out and opened it, and inside I found a collection of glass vials, each one labeled in a careful hand. Laudanum, chloral hydrate, morphine, and one vial with no label at all, containing a clear liquid that caught the lantern light like tears. "Alexander," I whispered, "look at this." He looked, and for the first time since I had met him, I saw fear in his eyes. Not the fear of ghosts or the unknown, but a more terrible fear, the fear of a man who realizes that the danger was closer than he ever imagined. "These are Dr. Blackwood's," he said. "I recognize his handwriting on the labels. But what are they doing here? And why is one of them unlabeled?" I did not have an answer, but I knew, with a certainty that went beyond evidence, that we had found something important. Someone had hidden these vials here, in a place where they were unlikely to be discovered. Someone with access to medical supplies. Someone with knowledge of drugs and their effects. Someone who had been at Ravensmoor the night Evangeline disappeared. "Dr. Blackwood," I said. "We must speak to him as well." Alexander nodded grimly. "He lives in the village. I will send for him tomorrow." But tomorrow came with unexpected complications. A letter arrived at breakfast, delivered by a messenger on a lathered horse. Alexander read it in silence, and I watched his face go pale. "What is it?" I asked. He looked at me, and there was something in his eyes that I had not seen before, something like shame. "It is from my sister," he said, "Lady Helena. She writes that she has heard rumors of my keeping company with a woman at Ravensmoor, a woman who is not of suitable station. She threatens to visit and investigate for herself." I felt my cheeks flush with a heat that was part embarrassment and part anger. "We have done nothing wrong," I said, though even as I spoke, I wondered if that was entirely true. We had spent hours together, alone, in circumstances that society would certainly find improper. We had touched hands, leaned close, shared confidences that proper strangers would never share. And I had felt, in those moments, things that a companion should never feel for her employer's grandson. Alexander set down the letter. "Helena has always been protective of the family name," he said. "She will not approve of our investigation. She will not approve of you." The words stung, though he did not mean them cruelly. I knew my place. I knew how society would see me, a poor relation with a strange reputation, consorting with a duke in a house full of shadows. It did not matter that our connection was born of something pure, the shared desire to bring justice to a woman who had been wronged. Society did not care about such things. Society cared only about appearances. "I should leave," I said quietly, Before she arrives, before she can cause trouble for you. No. Alexander's voice was firm, almost fierce. You will not leave. I will not let Helena drive you away, not when we are so close to the truth. You are the only person who can see Evangeline. You are the only person who can help me understand what happened to her. I do not care what my sister thinks. I do not care what society thinks. I care only about finding the truth and setting Evangeline free. He reached across the table and took my hand, and the touch sent a shock through me that I could not hide. His eyes met mine, and I saw something there that made my breath catch. Something that went beyond gratitude or partnership. Something that looked, impossibly, like the beginning of love. Cecilia, he said, and my name on his lips was like music. Stay. Please. I should have pulled away. I should have reminded him of his duty to Evangeline, of the ghost who still danced alone in the ballroom, waiting for him every night. I should have been sensible and proper, and all the things a woman in my position was supposed to be. But I was tired of being sensible. I was tired of being invisible. And when Alexander looked at me like that, I felt, for the first time in my life, like someone worth seeing. I will stay, I said. The smile that crossed his face was small, but genuine, the first real smile I had seen from him since the night we met. He squeezed my hand gently before releasing it, and we returned to our breakfast as though nothing extraordinary had happened. But something had happened. Something had shifted between us. Some invisible barrier had fallen. We were no longer just partners in an investigation. We were something more, something neither of us was ready to name. And somewhere in the shadows of Ravensmoor, a woman made of light watched us with eyes full of secrets she could not yet reveal. Lady Helena arrived 3 days later, in a carriage so polished it seemed to reflect the gray sky like a mirror. She was tall and dark-haired like her brother, but where Alexander's severity was softened by grief, Helena's was sharpened by judgment. She looked at me when I was presented to her, and I saw her take my measure in a single glance, cataloging my worn dress, my unadorned hair, my lack of jewels or status. So this is the companion, she said, and her voice made the word sound like an insult. I had heard you were peculiar, Miss Ashworth. I had not expected you to be so plain as well. I curtsied and said nothing. I had learned long ago that the best defense against cruelty was silence. Helena could not wound me with words if I refused to give them weight. But Alexander stepped forward, and his voice was cold as I had never heard it. You will treat Miss Ashworth with respect, Helena. She is a guest in this house, and she has been invaluable in helping grandmother with her care. Helena's eyes flickered between us, and I saw the calculation in them. She was not foolish. She saw the connection between her brother and me, saw it perhaps more clearly than we saw it ourselves, and she did not like what she saw. The next few days were difficult. Helena watched me constantly, following me with her eyes as I moved through the house, appearing suddenly in doorways and corridors as though hoping to catch me in some impropriety. She questioned the servants about my habits, my conversations, my relationship with the Duke. She was building a case against me, I knew, waiting for the evidence that would allow her to have me dismissed in disgrace. But she did not know about the ballroom. She did not know about Evangeline, and she could not see the ghosts that haunted her family's home, the secrets that were slowly rising to the surface after 5 years of silence. It was on the 4th night of Helena's visit that everything changed. I had gone to the ballroom alone, hoping to communicate with Evangeline without Alexander's presence. I wanted to spare him the pain of seeing her, if only for one night. I wanted to protect him, I realized, from the very grief I had come to help him resolve. But when I arrived, the ballroom was not empty. Helena stood in the center of the floor, a candle in her hand, staring at the place where Evangeline usually appeared. She did not see me enter. She was too focused on something else, something that made her face pale and her hands tremble. She She was looking at her own shadow, and her shadow was not alone. I watched in horror as the shadow of a woman formed beside Helena's, reaching toward her with transparent hands. It was not Evangeline. This shadow was darker, angrier, and as I watched, Helena let out a sob that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her. "I am sorry," she whispered to the empty air. "I am so sorry. I never meant for it to happen. I never meant for her to die." My heart stopped. Helena knew something. Helena had been hiding something for 5 years, something that was now being dragged into the light by forces she could not control. I stepped forward, and Helena spun toward me, her face contorted with fear and rage. "You," she hissed. "What are you doing here? What have you seen?" "I saw enough," I said, and my voice was steadier than I felt. "What did you do to Evangeline, Lady Helena? What are you hiding?" For a moment I thought she might attack me. Her hands clenched at her sides, and her eyes blazed with a hatred that seemed almost inhuman. But then something crumbled in her face, some wall that had been holding back years of guilt and terror, and she sank to her knees on the ballroom floor and began to weep. "I did not hurt her," she said between sobs. "I swear to you, I did not hurt her. But I knew. God help me. I knew what was going to happen, and I did nothing to stop it." I knelt beside her, my own fear forgotten in the face of her confession. "Tell me," I said. "Tell me everything." And Helena, broken at last by the weight of her secret, began to speak. Helena's confession came in fragments, broken by sobs and long silences during which she seemed to be gathering the courage to continue. I did not rush her. I understood, perhaps better than she knew, how difficult it was to speak truths that had been buried for years. "It began with jealousy," she said at last. "I was jealous of Evangeline, of the way Alexander looked at her, of the love they shared. I had always been the center of my brother's world, you see. After our parents died, it was just the two of us and grandmother. Alexander protected me, provided for me, made certain I wanted for nothing. And then Evangeline came, and suddenly I was invisible to him. I said nothing. I understood that jealousy too well. I had felt invisible my entire life, until a grieving duke had looked at me and seen something no one else could see." Helena continued, her voice steadying as she spoke. "I did not wish her harm. I want you to believe that, Miss Ashworth. I am not a monster. But when Dr. Blackwood came to me with his proposal, I did not refuse it. I should have refused it. I should have told Alexander. But I was angry and hurt and foolish, and I convinced myself that it was not truly wrong." "Dr. Blackwood," I repeated. "What did he propose?" Helena looked up at me, and her eyes were haunted. "He said he loved her. Evangeline. He had loved her for years, since before she met Alexander, since she was just a girl attending her first season. He had watched her from afar, had dreamed of her, had convinced himself that she would have chosen him if only Alexander had not interfered. He was obsessed with her, Miss Ashworth, obsessed in a way that was not quite sane." A chill ran down my spine. I thought of the vials in the cellar, the careful handwriting, the unlabeled bottle of clear liquid. I thought of the figure in Evangeline's vision, standing over her drugged body, speaking words she could not hear. "What did he want from you?" I asked. "He wanted me to help him take her away." Helena's voice dropped to a whisper. "He had a plan," he said. "He would drug her at the ball, carry her out through the servants' corridors, take her to a place where no one would find her. He would keep her there until she learned to love him, until she forgot about Alexander, until she understood that she belonged with him. He said it would only be for a little while. He said she would not be harmed." "And you believed him?" Helena shook her head miserably. "I did not know what to believe. I only knew that if Evangeline disappeared, Alexander would be free again. He would need me again. I told myself that Dr. Blackwood would take care of her, that she would be safe, that perhaps in time she really would come to love him. I told myself all the lies that jealousy whispers in the dark. I felt sick. I felt a rage building in my chest that I struggled to contain. Helena had allowed a madman to steal her brother's beloved, had stood by while an innocent woman was drugged and abducted, had watched Alexander's grief for 5 years without saying a word. It was monstrous. It was unforgivable. And yet, looking at her now, I saw that she had been punishing herself all along. The guilt had eaten her alive. The shadow that haunted her in the ballroom was not Evangeline, but her own conscience, given form by the strange power that seemed to permeate Ravensmoor. "Where did he take her?" I demanded. "Where is she now?" "I do not know." Helena's voice broke again. "He never told me. He said it was safer if I did not know, in case anyone suspected." After Evangeline disappeared, I waited for word from him, some sign that she was well, some indication that his plan had succeeded. But he said nothing. He continued his duties as our family physician as though nothing had happened, and I was too frightened to ask, "Is she alive?" Helena was silent for a long moment. Then she whispered, "I do not know that either." For the first year, I believed she must be. But then time passed, and there was still no word, and I began to fear the worst. Dr. Blackwood is not a stable man, Miss Ashworth. His love, if it can be called that, is possessive and consuming. If Evangeline refused him, if she continued to love Alexander despite everything, I do not know what he might have done. I stood abruptly, unable to remain still any longer. The pieces were falling into place now, forming a picture so dark and terrible that I could hardly bear to look at it. Dr. Blackwood had taken Evangeline. He had hidden her somewhere, perhaps in a place connected to Marcus Ashby's garden, perhaps somewhere else entirely. He had kept her drugged and captive, hoping to win a love that could never be won. And when she refused him, when she clung to her love for Alexander despite everything, he had done something unthinkable. But the ghost, Evangeline's ghost, was still here, still dancing in the ballroom, still trying to communicate with the living. If she were truly dead, would she not have passed on? Would she not have found some peace? Unless she could not. Unless something was holding her here, some unfinished business, some truth that needed to be revealed before she could rest. "We must find Dr. Blackwood," I said. "We must make him tell us what he did with her." Helena nodded, rising unsteadily to her feet. "I will help you. I owe Alexander that much. I owe Evangeline that much. Whatever penance I must pay, I am ready to pay it." I looked at her for a long moment, this woman who had caused so much suffering through her silence and her jealousy. I wanted to hate her. Part of me did hate her. But I also saw in her eyes something I recognized, the desperation of someone who had made a terrible mistake and would give anything to undo it. "Then come," I said. "We must tell Alexander everything." Finding Alexander was not difficult. He was where he always was at this hour, in the library, surrounded by his documents and his grief. When he saw Helena and me enter together, both of us pale and shaken, he rose immediately, his face tight with concern. "What has happened?" he asked. I let Helena tell him. It was her confession to make, her burden to lay down. I watched Alexander's face as she spoke, watched the emotions move across it like clouds across the sun. Confusion, disbelief, anger so fierce it seemed to burn in his eyes. And beneath it all, beneath the rage and the betrayal, something that might have been relief. He had spent 5 years believing that Evangeline had been taken by a stranger, a faceless monster who could never be caught. Now he knew the truth. Now he had a name. Now he could act. When Helena finished, Alexander was silent for a long moment. His hands were clenched at his sides, and I could see the muscles of his jaw working as he struggled to control himself. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and dangerous. "Where is Blackwood now?" "He has a cottage on the edge of the village," Helena said. "He lives there alone. He has no family, no servants, no one to witness whatever he does behind closed doors." Alexander moved toward the door, and I caught his arm. "Wait," I said. "We cannot simply confront him. If Evangeline is alive, if he is keeping her somewhere, we must be careful. If we frighten him, he might harm her. He might destroy any evidence of where she is." Alexander stopped, and I saw the struggle in his eyes. He wanted to find Blackwood immediately, to drag the truth from him by force if necessary. But he knew I was right. Blackwood was cunning and careful. He had evaded suspicion for 5 years. He would not confess easily. "What do you suggest?" he asked. "I suggest we search his cottage first, while he is away. He visits patients during the day. If there is any evidence of where he took Evangeline, it will be there." Alexander nodded slowly. "And what of my sister?" We all looked at Helena, who stood pale and trembling by the fireplace. She looked smaller than she had when she arrived at Ravensmoor, as though her confession had diminished her somehow, stripped away the armor of pride and judgment that she had worn for so long. "I will do whatever you ask," she said quietly. "If you wish me to leave, I will leave. If you wish me to help, I will help. I have no right to ask for forgiveness, Alexander. I only ask for the chance to make amends." For a long moment, brother and sister looked at each other. I could see the years of love and resentment between them, the complicated bond of family that had been twisted by jealousy and grief. Then Alexander sighed, and some of the tension left his shoulders. "You will help us search," he said. "You know Blackwood better than anyone. You may recognize things that we would miss." Helena nodded, and I saw tears of gratitude glisten in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you." We waited until the next morning, when we knew Dr. Blackwood would be making his rounds to patients in the nearby villages. Alexander sent a servant to confirm that the doctor had left his cottage, and when the confirmation came, the 3 of us set out in a small carriage, taking the back roads to avoid being seen. The cottage stood alone at the edge of a wood, a modest stone building with a thatched roof and windows that seemed to watch our approach like suspicious eyes. There was a garden behind it, overgrown and wild, and beyond the garden, a small outbuilding that might have been a stable or a storage shed. I felt something as we approached, a strange heaviness in the air, a sense of wrongness that made my skin prickle. This place held secrets. This place had witnessed things that should never have happened. We entered through the back door, which was unlocked. The interior was neat and orderly, almost obsessively so. Every book on the shelves was aligned perfectly. Every instrument in the medical case gleamed with polish. It was the home of a man who controlled every aspect of his environment, who could not tolerate chaos or disorder. But there were cracks in the perfection. As we searched, I began to notice small details that did not fit the careful facade. A drawer that would not open, locked tight against prying eyes. A section of the floor that sounded hollow when walked upon. A painting on the wall that hung slightly crooked, as though it had been moved recently and not quite replaced. "Alexander," I said, pointing to the painting. "There is something behind that." He moved the painting aside, and we found ourselves looking at a hidden compartment built into the wall. Inside were dozens of letters, tied with ribbon, and a journal bound in dark leather. Alexander took them out, and we gathered around the table to read. The letters were all addressed to Evangeline. They were love letters, passionate and disturbing, filled with declarations of devotion that bordered on madness. Dr. Blackwood wrote of his desire to possess her, to keep her away from a world that did not deserve her beauty, to create a paradise where only the 2 of them existed. He wrote of the plan to take her from the ball, of the cottage he had prepared for her, of the future they would share once she learned to love him as he loved her. But there were later letters too, letters that had clearly never been sent. These were darker, angrier, full of frustration and resentment. Evangeline had not learned to love him. She had refused to eat, refused to speak, refused to do anything but lie on her bed and weep for Alexander. She was ungrateful, Blackwood wrote. She did not understand the sacrifice he had made for her. She did not appreciate the love he offered. The final letter was the most chilling of all. It was dated 3 months after Evangeline's disappearance, and it was only a few lines long. She is gone now. I could not keep her any longer. She would not stop calling for him. Even in her sleep, even in her drugged stupor, she whispered his name. Alexander. Always Alexander. I gave her everything, and still she chose him. So I have made a choice of my own. She will sleep now, forever, in the garden of the man she loved so much. Let him find her if he can. Let him know that even in death she could not escape me. The garden of the man she loved. My vision flashed before my eyes. The formal garden, with its geometric hedges and sparkling fountain. Marcus Ashby's garden. Blackwood had buried Evangeline in the garden of her own cousin, the one place no one would think to look. I looked at Alexander, and I saw that he understood. His face was white, his eyes burning with a grief and rage that seemed too immense to be contained. But beneath the anguish, I saw something else. Resolution. Determination. The certainty of a man who finally knew what he had to do. "We must go to Marcus Ashby's estate," he said. "We must find her." Helena was weeping openly now, her hands pressed to her mouth. "I did not know," she said through her tears. "I swear to you, Alexander, I did not know he would do this. I thought he would keep her safe. I thought he loved her." Alexander did not look at his sister. He looked only at me, and in his eyes I saw a question. He was asking if I was ready for what came next. He was asking if I was strong enough to face what we might find. I took his hand in mine and held it tightly. "I am with you," I said. "Whatever we find, we face it together." We left the cottage immediately, taking the letters and the journal as evidence. The drive to Marcus Ashby's estate seemed to take forever, though it was only a few miles distant. Alexander sat rigid beside me, his jaw clenched, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Helena sat across from us, silent and pale, lost in her own guilt and grief. When we arrived, we did not go to the main house. We went directly to the garden from my vision, with its perfect hedges and its gleaming fountain. Marcus Ashby was not home, the servants told us. He had gone to London on business. But Alexander was a duke, and dukes do not ask permission. He demanded access to the garden, and the servants, confused but obedient, let us pass. The garden was beautiful in the late afternoon light, all green and gold and the soft splash of water, but I felt no beauty. I felt only dread, a heaviness that grew stronger with every step we took. I let my gift guide me. I closed my eyes and let the strange sense that had been with me since my accident lead me through the paths, past the hedges, past the fountain, to a corner of the garden where a small rose arbor stood. The roses were white, I noticed, white as a wedding gown, white as death. "Here," I whispered. "She is here." Alexander called for shovels. The servants brought them, bewildered but compliant, and as the sun began to set over the garden, we began to dig. It did not take long. The earth was soft, as though it had been disturbed not so long ago. And beneath the roses, beneath the dark soil that had covered her for 5 years, we found her, Evangeline. She lay in a wooden box, her hands folded across her chest, her pale hair spread around her like a halo. She wore the ivory gown from the night of the ball, now faded and stained with earth. Her face was peaceful, untouched by decay, preserved by some process that only a doctor would know. She looked as though she were sleeping. She looked as though she might wake at any moment and ask why we had disturbed her rest. Alexander fell to his knees beside the grave, and the sound that came from him was not quite human. It was a howl of grief, of rage, of a love that had waited 5 years to find its final resting place. He reached into the box and gathered Evangeline in his arms, holding her against his chest, rocking back and forth as tears streamed down his face. I stood apart, watching, my own tears falling silently. I had known, from the moment I read Blackwood's letter, what we would find. But knowing and seeing were two different things. Seeing Alexander hold the woman he had loved, the woman who had been stolen from him and hidden in the earth like a shameful secret, was almost more than I could bear. Helena sank to the ground, her face buried in her hands, her body shaking with sobs. The servant stood at a distance, stunned into silence. And then, in the fading light of the dying day, I saw her. Evangeline. Not the body in Alexander's arms, but the spirit, the woman of light and mist who had danced alone in the ballroom for 5 long years. She stood beside the grave, looking down at her own remains, and her face held an expression I had never seen before. Peace. She turned to me, and for the first time she smiled. It was a smile of gratitude, of release, of a soul finally unburdened. She looked at Alexander, still holding her body, and her smile softened into something infinitely tender. Then she bent down, and though she could not truly touch him, she pressed a kiss to his forehead, a breath of cold air that made him look up with a gasp. He saw her. For one brief moment, Alexander saw her as I saw her, glowing and beautiful and free. Their eyes met across the boundary of death, and something passed between them that I could not understand but could feel in every fiber of my being. Forgiveness, love, goodbye. Then she turned to me, and she spoke. It was the first time I had heard her voice, soft and musical and filled with a warmth that seemed impossible for a ghost. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you for finding me. Thank you for setting me free." I opened my mouth to respond, but she was already fading, dissolving into the twilight like mist in the morning sun. The last thing I saw was her smile, radiant and peaceful, before she vanished completely. And then there was only silence, and the roses, and Alexander kneeling in the earth with the body of the woman he had loved. The night that followed was the longest of my life. We brought Evangeline's body back to Ravensmoor and laid her in the chapel, surrounded by candles and flowers. Alexander sat beside her until dawn, holding her hand, speaking to her in a voice too low for me to hear. I did not intrude on his grief. I waited in the corridor outside, ready if he needed me, giving him the space to say goodbye. When the first light of morning crept through the chapel windows, Alexander emerged. He was pale and exhausted, his eyes red from weeping, but there was something different about him. The weight that had pressed him down for 5 years seemed lighter. The shadows that had haunted his face seemed softer. He had found his answers. He had found his peace. And though his heart was broken, it was a clean break now, a wound that could finally begin to heal. He looked at me, and I saw gratitude in his eyes. But I saw something else too. Something that made my breath catch and my heart race. I saw love. Not the grief-stricken love he had felt for Evangeline, but something new, something just beginning to bloom in the wreckage of his sorrow. He looked at me the way I had dreamed of being looked at my whole life, as though I was precious, as though I mattered, as though he could not imagine facing the future without me. "Cecilia," he said, and his voice was rough with emotion. "I do not have words to thank you for what you have done. You have given me back the truth. You have given Evangeline peace. You have given me hope that I might live again." I shook my head, suddenly shy, suddenly uncertain. "I did not do it for thanks," I said. "I did it because it was right, because Evangeline deserved justice, because you deserve to know the truth." He stepped closer to me, and I could smell the chapel incense on his clothes, could see the candlelight still flickering in his dark eyes. "I know," he said softly, "and that is why I love you." The words hung in the air between us, fragile and impossible, and more beautiful than any words I had ever heard. I wanted to believe them. I wanted to believe that a man like Alexander could love a woman like me, plain and strange and invisible to the world. But I was afraid. I was afraid that his love was born of gratitude, of shared grief, of the intensity of the circumstances we had faced together. "You do not have to say that," I whispered. "You are grieving. You are not thinking clearly. I have never thought more clearly in my life." He reached up and touched my face, his fingers gentle against my cheek. "I have spent 5 years in darkness, Cecilia. You are the light that led me out. I do not expect you to love me in return. Not yet. Not when everything is still so raw. But I want you to know that when the mourning is over, when Evangeline is buried and Blackwood is brought to justice, I will still be here, and I will still love you, if you will let me." I looked into his eyes, and I saw no deception there, no confusion, no gratitude masquerading as love. I saw only truth and hope, and the beginning of something that might become beautiful if we were brave enough to let it grow. "I do not know how to answer you," I said honestly. "I do not know if I am worthy of your love." He smiled, and it was the first true smile I had seen from him, unburdened by grief, untouched by shadow. "You are," he said. "You are worthy of far more than I can give. But I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of you." I did not kiss him then. It was not the time. Evangeline's body still lay in the chapel, waiting for burial. Blackwood still walked free, not yet knowing that his crimes had been discovered. There was still so much to be done, so many endings and beginnings still ahead of us. But I took his hand in mine, and I held it tightly, and I let myself believe, for the first time in my life, that I might be loved. The sun rose over Ravensmoor, golden and warm, chasing away the shadows of the night. Somewhere in the distance, a bird began to sing. And in the chapel behind us, surrounded by candles and flowers and the echoes of a love that had transcended death, Evangeline slept at last in peace. The days that followed Evangeline's discovery moved with the strange, suspended quality of a dream. There were arrangements to be made, authorities to be notified, a funeral to be planned. Alexander threw himself into these tasks with a determination that seemed almost desperate, as though keeping busy was the only way he could survive the flood of emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. I helped where I could, organizing correspondence, receiving visitors, ensuring that the household continued to function even as its master grieved. Helena remained at Ravensmoor, though her position in the house had changed irrevocably. She no longer walked with the proud bearing of a duke's sister. She moved quietly through the corridors, eyes downcast, speaking only when spoken to. She had offered to confess her role in Evangeline's abduction to the authorities, but Alexander had forbidden it. Her confession would serve no purpose, he said. It would not bring Evangeline back. It would only destroy what remained of their family and give society another scandal to feast upon. Helena would carry her guilt in silence, as she had carried it for 5 years, and that silence would be her punishment. I was not certain I agreed with his decision. Part of me believed that justice demanded a full accounting of everyone who had played a role in Evangeline's fate. But I also understood Alexander's reasoning. He had lost so much already. He could not bear to lose his sister as well, no matter how gravely she had wronged him. Doctor, Blackwood was another matter entirely. When the constables came for him, he did not resist. He stood in the doorway of his cottage, dressed in his usual impeccable black, and watched them approach with an expression of perfect calm. He had known, I think, that this day would come eventually. He had been waiting for it, perhaps even welcoming it, the way a man might welcome the end of a fever that has tormented him for years. They found more evidence in his cottage after we left. More letters, more journals, a detailed account of the 3 months he had kept Evangeline captive in a cellar beneath the garden shed, a cellar we had not thought to search. He had written everything down, every conversation, every rejection, every moment of his growing frustration as the woman he loved refused to love him back. It was a chronicle of madness, the authorities said, the work of a man who had lost all connection to reality. Blackwood did not deny any of it. At his trial, He sat silent and still while the prosecutor read his own words aloud, while witnesses testified to his obsession, while Alexander himself took the stand and described the 5 years of agony he had endured not knowing what had happened to his beloved. When asked if he had anything to say in his own defense, Blackwood simply smiled and shook his head. "I loved her," he said. "That is all I have ever done. That is all I ever wanted to do." He was convicted of abduction and murder and sentenced to hang. The execution took place on a gray morning in late November, and Alexander did not attend. He said there was no satisfaction to be found in watching a man die, no matter how much that man deserved it. Instead, he stayed at Ravensmoor and sat beside Evangeline's grave, now properly marked with a stone angel that seemed to watch over the gardens with gentle eyes. I found him there when the church bells rang noon, the hour appointed for Blackwood's death. He was not weeping. He was simply sitting, his hands folded in his lap, his eyes fixed on the angel's face. "It is done," I said quietly, sitting beside him on the stone bench. "It is finally done." He nodded slowly. "I thought I would feel something," he said. "Relief, perhaps, or closure. But I feel only emptiness, as though the part of me that was capable of hating him died along with him." I reached over and took his hand. "That is not emptiness," I said. "That is healing." He turned to look at me, and his eyes were soft with something I was still learning to recognize. "Perhaps you are right," he said. "You usually are." We sat together in silence for a long time, listening to the wind move through the trees, watching the winter light play across the angel's wings. It was peaceful there, in the garden where Evangeline now rested. Peaceful in a way that Ravensmoor had not been since I arrived. Finally, Alexander spoke again. "There is something I must tell you," he said. "Something I have been wanting to tell you for weeks." My heart quickened, though I tried to keep my face calm. "What is it?" He turned to face me fully, taking both my hands in his. "Cecilia," he said, and my name on his lips still made my breath catch. "I spoke to you of love on the morning after we found Evangeline. I told you that I would wait for you, that I would still love you when the morning was over. Do you remember?" "I remember." "The morning is not over," he said. "It may never be truly over. I will carry Evangeline in my heart for the rest of my life. But I have realized something in these past weeks. Grief and love are not enemies. They can exist together, side by side, without diminishing each other. I can honor Evangeline's memory and still open my heart to a new love. I can remember the past and still embrace the future." He paused, and I saw the vulnerability in his eyes, the fear of rejection that he was struggling to hide. "I love you, Cecilia," he said. "Not because you helped me find the truth, not because you gave me peace. I love you because you are brave and kind and compassionate. I love you because you see the world differently than anyone I have ever known, and that vision makes you beautiful. I love you because when I am with you, I feel hope for the first time in 5 years. I felt tears prick at my eyes, but I did not look away. I had spent my whole life hiding from love, convinced that I was too strange, too damaged, too invisible to deserve it. But Alexander saw me. He had always seen me from the very first moment in the ballroom when our eyes met across the candlelit darkness. "I love you too," I whispered. "I have loved you since the night you told me about Evangeline, since you trusted me with your grief, since you looked at me as though I mattered. I was afraid to believe it could be real. I was afraid that I was not worthy of you. You are worthy," he said fiercely. "You are more than worthy." He raised my hands to his lips and kissed them gently, first one and then the other. Then he leaned forward, and his lips met mine, and the world dissolved into warmth and light and a happiness so profound that it seemed impossible. When we finally drew apart, we were both trembling. Alexander pressed his forehead to mine, his breath mingling with mine, his eyes closed. "Marry me," he said. "Not today, not tomorrow, but someday, when you are ready, when the world has healed around us. Marry me and stay at Ravensmoor forever. Be my duchess, my partner, my love." I smiled through my tears. "Yes," I said. "Yes, I will marry you." He laughed then, a sound of pure joy that I had never heard from him before. He pulled me into his arms and held me close, and I could feel his heart beating against mine, strong and steady and full of life. Behind us, the stone angel watched over Evangeline's grave, and I could have sworn I saw its marble lips curve into a smile. The wedding took place in the spring, when the gardens of Ravensmoor had burst into bloom and the air was sweet with the scent of roses. It was a small ceremony, attended only by the Dowager Duchess, a few close friends, and Helena, who stood apart from the others with an expression of quiet sorrow and tentative hope. She had asked for permission to attend, and Alexander had granted it. He was learning to forgive her, slowly, though I knew the road would be long. I wore a gown of pale blue silk, chosen deliberately to avoid any resemblance to the ivory gown that Evangeline had worn on the night of her disappearance. Alexander had not asked me to make that choice, but I saw the gratitude in his eyes when he first beheld me walking toward him down the aisle. This was a new beginning for both of us, and it deserved its own colors, its own symbols, its own memories. The Dowager Duchess presided over the ceremony with her usual sharp-tongued efficiency, but I caught her wiping away a tear when Alexander and I exchanged our vows. She had grown fond of me in the months I had spent as her companion, and I had grown fond of her. She was the grandmother I had never had, fierce and loving and unafraid to speak her mind. After the wedding, there was a small reception in the newly reopened ballroom. Alexander had ordered it restored for the occasion. The dust cleared away, the candles replaced, the floor polished until it gleamed. It was no longer a place of grief and ghosts, but a place of celebration, of new beginnings, of love that had survived the darkness and emerged into the light. We danced together as the sun set outside the tall windows, and I felt Evangeline's presence one last time. Not as a ghost, not as a spirit trapped between worlds, but as a blessing, a warmth that settled over us like a benediction. She had found her peace, and she wished us to find ours. "Thank you," I whispered into the empty air. "Thank you for trusting me with your story." There was no answer, but I had not expected one. Evangeline was gone now, truly gone, and the ballroom was just a ballroom again, filled with music and laughter and the simple joy of people who had found their way back to happiness. In the years that followed, Ravensmoor transformed. The gardens were restored, the closed wings reopened, the shadows that had gathered in the corners chased away by light and life. Alexander and I made a home there, a real home, filled with love and warmth and the kind of peace that only comes after great suffering has been overcome. Helena eventually found her own redemption, though it took many years. She devoted herself to charity work, helping women who had been wronged by those who should have protected them. It was her penance and her purpose, and slowly, painstakingly, she rebuilt her relationship with her brother. She never fully forgave herself for what she had done, but she learned to live with her guilt, to transform it into something that helped rather than harmed. The Dowager Duchess lived long enough to see my first child born, a daughter with her father's dark hair and my eyes. She held the baby in her arms and pronounced her absolutely perfect, which was the highest compliment the old woman had ever given anyone. She passed away peacefully the following winter, surrounded by her family, content in the knowledge that Ravensmoor would continue. And I, Cecilia, the invisible woman, the strange one, the disappointment, became the Duchess of Ravensmoor. I became a wife, a mother, a woman who was seen and loved and valued. My gift did not leave me. I still saw things that others could not see, still felt the presence of those who lingered between worlds. But it no longer frightened me. It had led me to Alexander. It had given me purpose and meaning, and a love that transcended the boundaries of the visible world. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when the house was still and the children were asleep, I would walk down to the ballroom and stand in the center of the polished floor. I would close my eyes and remember the night I first saw Alexander there, dancing with his shadow, holding the hand of an invisible woman. I would remember the fear and the wonder and the strange, impossible hope that had stirred in my heart. And I would smile, because I understood now what Evangeline had been trying to tell us all along. Love does not end with death. It transforms. It transcends. It finds new ways to bloom, even in the darkest places, even in the coldest seasons. Evangeline had loved Alexander, and that love had brought him to me. She had been the bridge that connected us, the ghost that led me home. And though she was gone now, truly at peace in whatever realm awaited her, I carried her memory with me always. She was part of our story, part of our love, part of the miracle that had saved us both. The candles in the ballroom no longer burned on their own. The shadows no longer danced with invisible partners. But sometimes, when the light was just right and the wind whispered through the curtains, I could almost see her there, smiling, dancing, finally free. And I would whisper thank you into the silence, knowing somehow that she could hear me. On the 10th anniversary of our wedding, Alexander and I returned to the ballroom for a private celebration. The children were grown now, the eldest already making her debut in society, the youngest studying at university. The house was quieter than it had been in years, but it was a peaceful quiet, the quiet of a home that had known both sorrow and joy and had been made stronger by both. Alexander took me in his arms and led me onto the dance floor, and we waltzed together as the stars appeared outside the windows. He was older now, his dark hair touched with gray, lines of laughter and sorrow carved into his handsome face. But his eyes were still the same, still filled with the love that had first bloomed in this very room, still looking at me as though I was the most precious thing in his world. "Do you remember," he murmured, "when you first came to Ravensmoor?" "I remember everything," I said. "I remember the fog and the fear and the feeling that I had finally come home." He smiled and pulled me closer. "I did not know then what you would become to me," he said. "I did not know that the strange young woman who could see ghosts would become the love of my life. But I think Evangeline knew. I think that is why she showed herself to you. She was giving me permission to love again." I rested my head against his shoulder and let the music carry us around the floor. "Perhaps she was," I said. "Or perhaps she simply saw in me what you would later see. A woman who understood loss. A woman who was ready to believe in love." "Both," he said. "It was both." We danced until the candles burned low and the music faded into silence. Then we stood together at the window, looking out at the gardens where Evangeline rested beneath her stone angel, and at the moon rising over the moors beyond. "I love you," I said, the words as natural and necessary as breathing. "I love you more than I knew it was possible to love anything." "And I love you," Alexander replied, his arm tight around my waist, his lips brushing my hair. "Forever, beyond forever." The wind stirred the curtains, and for just a moment I felt a warmth settle over us, a presence that was both familiar and beloved. Then it was gone, and we were alone again, two people who had found each other against all odds, who had built a life together in the ruins of grief, who had discovered that love, true love, can survive anything, even death, even time, even the shadows that dance alone in empty ballrooms, waiting for someone to finally see. I looked at Alexander, and he looked at me, and we did not need to speak. We had said everything that mattered long ago, in a candlelit library, in a moonlit garden, in 1,000 quiet moments that had woven themselves into the fabric of our lives. We had been broken, both of us. We had been haunted, both of us. But we had found each other in the darkness, and together we had walked into the light. And that, in the end, was the only story that mattered. The ballroom stood empty now, the candles extinguished, the music silent. But in the shadows on the floor, if you looked closely enough, you could almost see them still. Two figures dancing, holding each other close, spinning through eternity in a waltz that would never end. Love had won. Love had always won. And somewhere beyond the veil, in a place where shadows became light and sorrow became joy, Evangeline smiled and let go of her partner's hand at last. She had waited 5 years for someone who could see her. And I had seen her. I had set her free. And in doing so, I had found my own freedom, my own love. My own happily ever after. The story was complete. The dance was finally done.